can you build this shadow CFO, this proactive system that is analyzing every piece of data in a company consistently? When we talk to some of these CFOs, like CFOs of Spotify and Netflix and a bunch of the world's biggest companies, they'd be like, look, these companies are just flying blind. They have no idea what they're doing when they're making decisions. Understanding millions, billions, trillions of data points across the company and actually enable you to do the strategic financial analysis that needs to be done company consistently.
There's a bit of agentic capabilities in the sense that at first glance, we need to break things in because we're working with natural language, but the more and more Sapien works with a company, the more it'll get insights on what are the processes I'm looking at, what is the templates I want to export into, and caches those, reuses them. It allows you to not necessarily call an LLM every time you want to do a task. So it's less dependent on the language model.
We actually ended up getting our first really big 6-figure contract literally off of understanding that they had a $10 million mistake.
Hello and welcome to 1 to 100, a podcast that takes you inside the most promising hypergrowth startups in a conversation with the founders themselves at the helm. Our goal is to give you the inside story alongside empirical analysis of a notable tech company that you might want to join. I'm your host, Usman Hanif, the author of the Why You Should Join newsletter.
Welcome to 1 to 100, where every week we sit down with the founders of some of the most notable hypergrowth startups. As always, my name is Usman, and I am one of the co-authors of Why You Should Join, and also the host of the podcast. Today's company, Sapien, has built the first fully autonomous financial analyst for enterprise finance teams. Sapien deeply understands company financials and tackles complex day-long workflows in just minutes. In just 3 months of building, they have secured customers across manufacturing services and software businesses, including top private equity portfolio companies. For these companies, they've saved thousands of hours of work, enabled key strategic decisions, and even caught multi-million-dollar mistakes. Not to mention, as college dropouts, they've raised $8.7 million in a seed round by General Catalyst. I'm super excited to be chatting with Ron Nachum, Pranav Ravella, and Arya Grayeli, the company's co-founders. Guys, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Well, this is kind of new for us. We usually only have one person on here, but we have the full co-founding team, so this is a full treat. But we'll just go in and dive right into it. So obviously the one-liner here is a fully autonomous financial analyst. Sounds super exciting, super cool, but let's try to break this down more concretely for the audience. What exactly is the product you're selling? And better yet, what is the burning problem that you're solving?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing that is one of the biggest problems in the world today for a lot of the biggest companies is that CFOs need to make the most important decisions for a company, right? They used to be this defensive person who kind of will look at the financials for the last month or the last year and just try to analyze them and see what went wrong or what went well. And they've quickly become this offensive player within companies where they're actually not just going back and auditing numbers, but trying to make the most important forward-looking decisions. And as this has happened, the software that's equipping them to do this really hasn't improved. And we're looking at analysts that are analyzing multi-million row Excel spreadsheets. Literally when we first started this, we would talk to some of the world's biggest companies and see that they were running on 3 massive Excel spreadsheets, and they were just all linked together with formulas, or, hundreds of ERPs, which are enterprise resource planning systems that basically have all their data. And they were all just disjoint and disconnected. And they had to export it all into Excel, analyze it. And ultimately, when we talk to some of these CFOs, like CFOs of Spotify and Netflix and a bunch of the world's biggest companies, they'd be like, look, these companies are just flying blind. They have no idea what they're doing when they're making decisions. And so we came to build Sapien because we saw this as a problem that this is exactly the type of work that AI should be doing and humans shouldn't be when it comes to understanding millions, billions, trillions of data points across the company and actually enable you to do the strategic financial analysis that needs to be done. So the product that we have is basically this system that builds what we call a company representation. And so we can understand the data about a company across different sources, all the context behind it, because finance is about more than just numbers. And it can then enable teams to ask open-ended questions like comparing 2 regions to one another, or automate a workflow like attribution analysis or variance analysis that might take an analyst multiple days to do down to a few minutes. And it basically is just changing the way that these teams can do their financial work to be much faster, much more accurate, and ultimately drive better decisions for these companies, especially when the finance team has become so central to doing this type of work.
See, and so to be clear there, really what you're helping out with is helping these CFOs be more proactive and also be better planners than just cost and spreadsheet monkeys that maybe they were more defensive in the past, like you say?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is that, technology for them to be offensive just hasn't existed so far, right? Like, if you look at current financial planning and analysis tools or strategic finance tools, they wake up in the morning, they look at a bunch of nice, pretty dashboards and graphs, and they spend hours and hours trying to put those graphs into Excels and then put them in a board deck, right? But the actual manual labor process of doing this doesn't allow them to think about the strategic mindset of how do we actually run this company better, right? If you think about it, finances need to operate across every single piece of data in a company, right? Like your sales information, your customer information, your accounting information, and it's the most intersectional part of the company. And by using all of that data, they should have access to not just reconciliate numbers and saying, hey, we went over budget here, but how do you actually allocate capital in low profit margin businesses to be the most effective? For example, for an industrial manufacturer out in Michigan, right? Like they don't have these types of tools, and we want to be able to enable them to drive better decisions, make higher profit margins, and be more efficient, and bring tech into a world that just has never been done for finance, and in more specific, hundreds of businesses across the country.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And so, I mean, you said it yourself, which is finance is something that at a company spans sort of all departments, right? And there's obviously so much that you can do, and there's so many different insights that you can extract from the data that is siloed away in these different databases. Where are you guys starting off first at? Like, how do you sort of make this a bite-sized task for an early stage company? Because obviously, I mean, I see the pitch, right? Which is AI should be able to do pretty much all of this, right? But, obviously that's, well, maybe it is not possible on day one, right? And so I'd love to see where you guys are starting.
Yeah, so where we originally started is Excel. That's like the language of finance. That's where everyone, like, regardless whatever system you're on, you export it into an Excel and you crunch the numbers there. So that's what everyone's so familiar with. And regardless whatever system they're on, whether it's antiquated or new, Excel is what they're familiar with. So we take that and basically built, in our opinion, a state of the art Excel parser that can understand the complexities of this financial tabular data that you're working with. And it's like you have a bunch of these like tables within a sheet, and there's like a table that a row that corresponds with a number all the way across another sheet where there's another table in between. There's like these huge complexities that you see with financial data that isn't really there in a lot of these other domains. And the fact that we are only working with this enterprise finance, this FP&A data, that kind of allows us to have certain assumptions about how we do this parsing, and gives us these restrictions that actually allow us to, instead of like a, off the shelf Excel parser, we can really like extract the insights and the story behind each number. And that's what we're really in the business of, is not necessarily like figuring out exactly like what is this number. It's more of like, what is the context behind this number? And we care about this row and column inside this sheet, inside this like Excel workbook, inside this folder, and that allows us, so when we want to like pull it or do an operation on top of it, we're really looking at that whole context behind it and pulling it, and then doing stuff with that. And so we originally started with this giant Excel parser. The first 2 weeks of building this company was only focused on how do you take these, like, as Ron mentioned, multi-million row Excels and make sense of them and allow them to like leverage into whatever like system that originally we're doing just Q&A on. The step beyond that, as we've matured and developed, is like we're looking into integration. So starting with NetSuite, which is very common ERP, and then you're going into like the data lakes you're looking at. So you integrate with their Snowflake database, and you're doing like SQL queries to get this large tabular data across all different types of data sources. So you have not only your product data, but you also have your accounting data, and all of that together is like the types of modalities that we work with. And really what that looks like is just this tabular data, like a pandas data frame in Python is kind of what we're extracting, along with all the textual insights that come around it. And with that allows us to like create these graphs or do these operations and give insights on, what was the difference between my budget and actuals, and what were the drivers behind those differences, and how does that update my forecasts? And then we can basically drive the value that FP&A analyst does for a company.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely dive into a lot more about some of the tech behind all of this. Just two final questions on like the front of helping the audience paint a pretty clear picture of what it is that the product looks like today. Maybe let's walk through it from the perspective of like a user. So who is this user? Is it the CFO? They come on, they make an account. what do they see? Like, what do they do now? They're on the website.
Yeah, I mean, I think the coolest thing about our product is that there's a lot of different possible users. And again, early on, it's very important for us to stay verticalized. And a lot of the essence of your last question is kind of it's the meat of a lot of AI products today, where it's like you can try to like eat the entire world and solve 100 problems in one. But the key thing that we realized from day one is we want it to be super hyper verticalized, solve a very specific type of process, and do it in a very specific way. And so, today when we onboard customers, the way that it works is, usually we start out talking to a CFO, a head of FP&A, like the decision maker that kind of, runs this team and helps them, run effectively. We then oftentimes sit down with, an analyst or someone who's like very in the weeds and just talk to them for 30 minutes or an hour and just like learn a lot about their company. And for us early on, before we really developed a lot of those systems that we now have that automate a lot of this work, this is a good way for us to build intuitions. And I think, especially building a startup in such like a deeply complex space as this one, like getting deep insights into the day to day and every in and out of how they operate is so important. And so then when it comes to actually using the product, today most of our users tend to be either the analysts or the heads of FP&A at these companies. And what they do is, they onboard to the platform, they can integrate with a bunch of their Excels, with their ERP, with their CRM, with other data sources. And the cool thing is pretty much right away, they can ask questions and get insights from them. And this is always the really powerful thing here is people in this industry are used to it taking 6 months, 12 months, millions of dollars to onboard onto a new platform to do work. And the powerful thing about Sapien is because we have, these systems that can parse these large spreadsheets or pull data from these integrations, we can have that time to value that's an hour or even a few minutes, depending on how much data that they're working with. And then what they can do is kind of two main things that we've been working up to until today. The first is open-ended questions. So literally just typing in like an ad hoc analysis they want to run, like why is region A doing better than region B? Or why did profits go up in this area? And they can, see exactly how it's thinking about the process, right? A huge thing is observability. So you can see exactly how Sapien is thinking about it, where it's pulling data from, what assumptions it's making, and you can actually challenge every single thing that it's doing there. The other thing that we realized that was really important for immediate impact was workflows. And so we kind of mentioned the idea of being verticalized and having quick time to value. The other problem that a lot of AI tools suffer from that we really wanted to avoid was building something that had a nice flashy demo, but didn't really drive value to customers. And so we quickly realized that we could take the way we built our system and basically program in structured workflows where a company could upload a one-page document on here's how we do attribution analysis, or here's how we do variance analysis of the process. And it could basically constrain this open-ended system, which we can go into the tech a lot more detail later. But it's like, you imagine this like graph of reasoning, but instead of it being completely open-ended and you can pick whatever tool to use next, it's much more limited in its scope. And what this means is that we can quickly take a process that used to take 4 analysts a week and do it in 5 minutes. And so now you're getting that immediate value where you can go and say, hey, I want to run attribution analysis. Here's my data. Here's the months I want to look at. And they can just type in the questions that they want. They can follow up. They can dig in. They can challenge the assumptions. And the whole goal here is treating it not like a dashboard, not like another app that they're using, but truly like a human coworker that actually understands what they're doing, which has driven a lot of value.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, based on the way you've just described it, it really is like a CFO's co-pilot. Like it's, a CFO has their FP&A team, and it sounds like you hire tons of analysts there that go out there and find answers for you, which often takes tons of time and tons of labor. And now you have this agent that can do it for you instead. And I don't want to use that word agent too lightly. I am actually curious, are there agentic capabilities with Sapien? Like, how are you guys doing this? This would be a great time to maybe discuss a little bit about this tech, because you made some great points, which is one, giving people observability, two, letting them also question like how the answer was derived. How is this all working? I know this is probably a very thorough, and we could talk about this for hours, but I'm curious how, at a high level, how would you kind of give the audience a snippet of what is the tech behind all of this?
Arya is so excited.
Yeah, like just a quick overview and then we can go a lot deeper. But at its core, we're trying to learn like a mapping from financial query to answer. And it's in the context of this company representation we learned, which is, I'd say like the real details, that's where like our real edge is, and we can get into that after. But at inference time, right now you ask a question, and what it does is it takes it and it decides like, okay, I'm going to like split it into like nodes and like create this tree of basically approximating that function from financial query to answer. And when we like create this tree, it's like, am I going to be calling like the tools that I know, or am I going to be like doing a planning stage and like breaking it down? And in that way, like it is somewhat agentic, is like I have all the context of the company. I'm like pulling from our concept library, which I'll describe later, which tells us, okay, this question, what does this mean in the context of this company? And then, okay, this means I need to do step 1, step 2, step 3. And then when I'm trying to process those, do I need to split it even further, or I'm at a point where like I can use, in this case, our verifiable tool module, which, I used to do research in library learning. In this case, what we do is like we have, a library of like these functions that we've code gen in the past and have verified for them to be true and to work in the way that we want it to. And we can, use those in addition with like what we currently code gen to do a bunch of operations on this tabular data, or like create this graph, for example. And then that gets propagated back up. And then we look at it, we move it to stage 2, and then it decides, okay, I want to split further, if I want to like answer it immediately. And this tree that's created is like at the leaves, it does these like actions, and the information is propagated up and up and up until it creates this, like, in a way, like documents, like a Word document of, okay, this was my thought process. Stage 1 had this, and this steps. And like I can cite every number that I pulled, or you hover over the number, it'll tell you, I pulled this number from this source, applied it, like I added it with this number. Maybe I did this other operation on top of it. Or like if I hover over a graph, it'll give you that same types of insights on like where exactly in the Excel sheets or the integrations, like in with my ERP, that the numbers come from. And by breaking it down into this tree, we can kind of keep context of like where I pulled from and what actions I did. And that also allows us to like, if we look at a subtree and like in our human loop system, the user gives feedback like, hey, I really like what you did here. Or I really like, as Ron mentioned, challenge this. I really didn't like what you do here. We cache that and we add that to our library of like, in this case, if it was good, like, okay, this is like, this entire subtree was really good. And we can abstract that away into a single function call and then reuse it. So next time, like instead of breaking into stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and breaking stage 2 into multiple things, we can just reuse something. And that allows us to not call an LLM and actually trust the outputs. So there's a bit of agentic like capabilities in the sense that at first glance, like, yeah, we need to break things in because we're working with natural language, but the more and more like Sapien works with a company, the more it'll get insights on what are the processes I'm looking at, what is the templates I want to export into, and caches those, reuses them, the concept of library learning I was talking about, and then it allows you to like not necessarily call an LLM every time like you want to do a task. So it'll just like start learning and building up that representation, so it's less dependent on a language model.
Yeah, I mean, just adding a little bit more into like, how does this tech actually impact a user, right? Like, I think one of the really cool portions of what we're doing is this entire aspect of like the tree of reasoning. So every single question can kind of get decomposed into more queries, and you see what actions it's actually pulling down from, and how is it using those actions to decompose into further questions. And that reasoning and that fully like that thought process that's going into making this happen isn't actually something that you see in finance today, right? You are a CFO or head of FP&A and you go tell your analyst, go create me this model or go answer me this question, and they return back to you an answer. But this entire decision process of where they're pulling information from, how are they constructing this model in Excel, none of this actually can be given to the CFO to analyze and say, hey, you did this wrong here, right? The reason being is that if you were a CFO and has to look through all this information, it would take you 3 or 4 days to go do and see if this is right or not. But what we want to really do is actually change a lot of how finance is run at companies by being able to provide this entire tree of reasoning where you're pulling information from in just a couple minutes, and you can click down and navigate all the way through. You now have that observable process, which just could never be done before and previously had multi-million-dollar errors, but this is now something you can quickly fix on the fly.
Yeah. And definitely we'll ask you about the observability, and but for one last, I guess, question on the tech itself. Again, and I'm coming at this without obviously being in the product or anything like that, but completely makes sense how a lot of your reasoning can be done by using LLMs, and it sounds like you have a lot of proprietary work on branching this work out and also caching some of the work that you've done before. In terms of the actual like actions, right, of like pulling information from a sheet or filling information into a sheet, for some of the more like tech inclined folks in the audience, do a lot of the actions and like, one, are those automated, and two, like, can you talk a little bit more about how you've built these automations to, it's one thing to pass all this context and help an LLM reason correctly, but then it's also another to go and like do the actions that the LLM is telling you to do. How do you guys deal with all of that?
Yeah, so a lot of our actions, because the domains we work on are just like I mentioned, pandas data frames, so just these tabular data. So the actions that we have are generally like, these small pieces of code that you just do code gen on. And so, the idea is that each node in our graph, like at that point you've localized and like loaded into like this temporary context. Like, okay, what are the data frames that are important here? And the goal is, okay, I have an objective, is in like, I want to extract this type of number. This is the type of data has my inputs. Let me code-gen like a way of like, calculating that based off the inputs I have available. And that's a tricky problem. I mean, like, I used to do research in like program synthesis, and like, however you want to approach that, whether you want to use like an autoregressive like model, such as, a language model for it, or if you want to approach it from a different perspective, that's still like really difficult. And the way we kind of found that this is tackleable from the FP&A perspective is that we have these library functions that, we've cached and we reuse, and we know those are correct. And we realize that like a lot of these like processes that, humans right now are doing in Excel, and even like an extension of them that they can't even think of doing, there's probably only like 30 to 40 functions that are actually like useful here. You have like a group by on a pandas data frame, like, and a couple like arithmetic operations and a weighted average here, and then you're graphing it into like these couple different formats. But aside from that, it's just like an orchestration of those, and that is like pretty easy for a language model to do given those library functions as context. So really the hard part here is just how do you like learn those library functions? And we give like, some base ones off the fly, which is like super simple. But the real aspect of like, I think our edge, as I was mentioning, is this company representation. And one part of that is like learning these library functions, both through our onboarding system and then also through like just, human loop feedback. I'm like, I'm running Sapien. As I said, I challenged this aspect, and I found that this function that I code gen here was really good. Okay, I'm going to abstract it away and reuse it when I like apply it in a similar context again. That's kind of how we like do these actions at the lowest level. And also, like, as I mentioned, breaking down the problem from a really like, hey, what's wrong with my company? Like, that's the overall question, breaking it down. Okay, I need to think about this, this, and this, and in the smaller and smaller components until when you reach one of these like leaf nodes that you're doing an action on, it's totally like, it's totally feasible for, hey, like, okay, I can actually do this now. That's kind of how we approach it. It's very dependent on the fact that we're in a pretty constrained domain. I think like applying this generally is like definitely tricky. It's an unsolved problem, obviously. And so that's another reason why, like, the Excel data we're working with is very constrained. There's restrictions, assumptions we can make because we're working with this type of data. Same thing with the operations we do upon it. That's kind of what I think what allows us to work fairly well out of the box, even this early in the company.
Hey, 1 to 100 will be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Our sponsor for today's episode is Carta, the end-to-end accounting platform that's purpose-built to power the strategic impact of the fund CFO. For the first time ever, private fund operators can now leverage their very own bespoke software that's designed from the ground up to bring their whole portfolio together, enabling formations, transactions, and distributions to flow seamlessly and accurately. The end result? A remarkably fast and precise platform that empowers better strategic decision-making and delivers transformational insights on demand, timely K1s, holistic fund performance data, and so much more. Come see the new standard in private fund management at carta.com/investors. That's carta.com/investors. There are over 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the United States and millions more around the world. How do you know which ones can make the biggest impact with your donation? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They pore over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-backed organizations that are saving and improving lives. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Eric Torenberg at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Econ 102 to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
Yeah. And I promise this is the last question on the actual company and the product, and we'll get into the much funner stuff in a second here. I guess some of this will be discussed when we talk about you guys, but don't let the young age fool anyone. These guys are very, very technically savvy and competent people. you did bring up this keyword that triggered a question that I did have for you guys, which is the hard part about all of this, right? Like, what about this is hard? Again, just even orchestrating and working with all of this is hard in itself. But what would you guys say? I mean, we heard Arya talk a little bit about how, a lot of it has to do with company representation. I'm curious, Ron and Pranav, like, you know, maybe speak to that a bit more. Like, what is really just hard about this that you guys have cracked and you're fairly confident that other people may not be able to crack so easily?
I think actually like one of the really cool parts of what we're doing at Sapien is almost every single like thing that we're doing can be categorized as its own research project or startup, right? Like, for example, building a representation of unstructured information and data. That in itself is a huge unsolved problem. And I think we've done extremely well at that, right? Like being able to take information from customer data, Salesforce data, Excels, all the random contextual information that involves numbers that is just so random and can't be defined to a strict SQL table, and building that representation of it so that we can work with it and actually pass that context around in our system in a very effective manner that can be broken down, I think is something that we've really, really nailed so far. And I think that really puts us over the edge compared to, systems that, might have a new research project or might have a new thesis come out about it. I think one really good testament about all of this is Microsoft, like the LLM spreadsheet parser got released a couple months ago, and a lot of our friends sent it to us and they're like, hey, like this is going to be super useful. And we look through the spreadsheet and look at what data they're using and look at how they're actually conducting a lot of this. And it was just months behind of like where we started. It was like what we were doing on day one. And I think that's a really cool thing because we were able to constrain ourselves into this FP&A domain, and we were able to make such cool breakthroughs as to how do you actually make assumptions about the type of data that you're working with to solve this unstructured data problem. I think that's one really cool aspect. Ron can touch a little bit more about, we're also building like 20 startups in one, right? Like this entire thing of how you pass information across all these different nodes, right? How do you, for example, make a proactive system, which is our grandiose vision of like, if data is coming in, how do you run these models automatically, right? I think even going down to the more technical level, right? We're making hundreds, thousands of API calls to GPT, OpenAI, Claude, and everything, and how you schedule all these operations. That in itself was another startup, and I think like that really like underscores the technical thing that we're trying to accomplish here, which is there's so many different parts to this, and every one of these systems can get a lot better with the people that we're hiring. But I think we've made really, really good headway with this representation. I think that will carry us a long way.
Yeah. I mean, you said it very well. I think one thing that I always think about, and I think this is like kind of my mindset when it comes to building something like this, is no AI solution today, I think, has cracked the UX problem effectively. Like, especially like it's so important for consumer, but it's arguably even more important for enterprise. Like, these are deeply complex systems that we just don't know how to use right now. Like a chat interface is not the right format, right? People don't know what to ask. It's like too open-ended. Like it just isn't built the right way. And, we look at companies like Cognition and like Ramp as like, really interesting companies in this space that we have a lot of respect for. We talk to the teams a bunch, like we work pretty closely with some of them. And I think the key thing is that we're very different because, for example, Cognition is an automated software engineer, right? As I'm sure the audience knows. And the interesting thing is that they can expose a lot of the guts of how it works to the audience because their audience is technical. And this is actually making their problem a little bit easier because they can show where the code has errors. They can show how it's code genning. They can show all the little pieces how it works. This tool is built for financial analysts. We can't show them the Python pandas code that's being generated, right? We can't break down and show them error logs and have them go through them and figure out what's going wrong. And that's actually the beauty of the problem that we're working on, is that there's no shortcuts for us in how we actually build this system to be usable. And I think that's so exciting because as much as we're working on a really, really difficult AI problem and actually trying to build like these systems that understand companies and build these systems that can be proactive and all these types of things, it's all about how do you actually make this thing useful to an end user. And so we spend a lot of time building this thing we call like translation layer, or our middleware, if you will. And basically what it does is it's this layer that sits between our agentic systems that are doing all this, like, this graph of reasoning, passing all these data, calling all these tools, and our UX and our front end that's actually displaying things to the user. And it literally goes in and it prioritizes, like, what things should the user be seeing? How can I convert what I just did into a user-oriented format where they can hover over this and understand what happened? Like, when we show anything to the user, they can hover over every number and see the path for exactly how it was calculated. And this is all handled by this translation layer. And I think it's something that like companies in our position could easily neglect. Like, especially you think about like companies full of AI researchers who are super technical and just kind of want to build the next technology. You can sometimes forget like why you're building it is for the person on the other side of the table to like have true joy with what they're using. And I think that's one of the challenges that we've done really well at, and especially because we spend so much time just talking to customers. When we started Sapien, it was literally like I would cold email hundreds of CFOs from my Harvard email, just be like, hey, I'm a rising junior. I'm building, this project for a class. I would love to learn about what you do day to day. And literally like the last few months at school was just like constantly on calls and like talking to these people. But ever since, like we're still doing that, like constantly talking to CFOs and analysts, understanding what they do and like putting the product in their hands, like throwing it right in front of them and being like, how would we make this more usable? And I think that's the crux of what we're doing here is that it's half an AI problem and it's half a usability problem. And sure, a lot of the usability comes with having a better AI, right? Like the better your system gets, the more you can like make it visible on how it's operating. That makes the end goal much easier. But I think that's something that we've done really, really well. And when I look at the future of this company and for us, like what we're going to do best over the next few months, it's really about productizing the cutting edge of AI. It's not just creating it, it's figuring out how to make it easy to use. And I think that's an interesting angle that I don't think enough people think about when it comes to building these types of products.
That's very compelling. And I guess for any potential customer listening, it's really good to hear when a team is telling you how much they care about your usability more than just that building that fanciest tech that they can build. So that's really awesome. You sort of talked a little bit about it, which is, kind of, I guess, touched on it, which is you guys have talked to a lot of people. This involved a lot of cold emailing. I guess this naturally transitions into the question that a lot of people probably have, which is your 3 college dropouts, sort of the Silicon Valley darling story, right? Yeah, people dorm room working on something that could be a multi-billion dollar business. Let's start cracking into that founding story a little bit. I guess for starters, I'd love to maybe discuss a little bit about early days for each of you. What have you guys been doing to the point where now that you're 20 something years old and already working on this huge startup, like who are the people behind these names? Who are the people behind the camera here?
For sure. I think like we always talk about our founding stories a lot. And I think all of us have this common element in mind, which is we were always super curious about the world from a very young age. And I think that motivated us to really join together and do this. But I think for me, it really came from honestly wanting to beat my sister out in a lot of stuff. So I was, like 5 or 6, and my sister was like 5 years older than me, and she was getting into a lot of the robotic stuff, like the Lego NXTs, like the EV3s at the time. And I saw her doing all this, and I was like, like I could be better than her at all this. And so I started learning like how to make robots. And when I was in like 2nd or 3rd grade, I made like an automatic toilet flusher with a Lego NXT and
Oh, wow.
this other type of stuff. And I was really interested in like, like just like solving cool things with like technology. And I think there was an element of this where as I kind of progressed, it was like I really enjoyed playing video games, and now I really wanted to know how to create my own video game, right? There was like things I saw and I was like, I could do better than most of the people that are developing this. I never did, but yeah. And then I kind of got into like middle school and high school where I started really learning about computer science and how to code and all this other type of stuff. But there was this inherent curiosity for me, which is like I could build something, but like how do I break it? And so I got a computer in middle school, and one of the first things I really learned how to do was just how to hack stuff. And so I got really big into cybersecurity, learning how to do some network hacking. I was really interested in combining hardware stuff with cybersecurity as well. And like, for example, doing hardware hacking and all this other type of stuff. And then it got to a point where I got in trouble a lot, like a ton. My parents kept grounding me. The school kept grounding me. And eventually my mom was like, look, like if you don't stop doing any of this, you're going to go to boarding school in India. And I was kind of bummed because my other opportunity at the time was to go to Thomas Jefferson High School, which was an amazing STEM school. And I was like, I don't really know if I want to go back to India, maybe never see my parents again or do this. And so I was like, maybe alternate and actually do something that's good with my time. And then I really started learning about how you could actually do cybersecurity at some of the top companies in the world and some of the top research labs in the world. And this was around the time when RL agents were a huge thing. And I got into really the field and research of like using RL agents for network hacking and hardware hacking and all this other type of stuff. And that really, really interested me. And so one fateful day, as we would know it, it was freshman year. I was at chess club, as most normal high schoolers would do, and I was with all my friends. And I was beating all my friends out. Exactly. I was beating all my friends out, and Arya sits down right across from me, and he's like, "I don't know how to play this game. Do you want to play?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course. I mean, like, why not?" And so I was giving off, trying to four move checkmate him, and wasn't really paying attention. I was like, "Haha, I could beat this guy in like 5 moves." Turns out he actually beat me in 8, which was kind of crazy. And then I was like, I don't really know if who you claim you are. And we started playing for the next 2 hours. And I think like that was such a cool moment for me because I never met someone that was so intellectually challenging for me, but like also was such a cool person to talk to. And sophomore year, I was like, I have this problem, which was converting 2D images into 3D reconstructions to be used within orthopedic surgery.
Yeah, as all sophomores in high school do, right? Like, that was the problem I had. That's hilarious.
And I was like, who's the smartest guy that I know that I would enjoy spending all of COVID working on this project with? And I was like, maybe it's the guy that just beat me in chess. Right? So I messaged him out of the blue and I was like, hey, Arya, let's do this. Are you interested? And he was watching anime at the time and he was like, maybe you could do something better with my time. And that fateful day is when I started working with Arya on this really cool research project, won a bunch of awards for it, became really close with Ron as well, because he was Arya's really good friend at the time. And then kind of went into college really appreciating the computational agentic stuff, the ML stuff behind all the problems that I was solving and wanted to apply it for certain fields and really grew out of the cybersecurity phase. I wasn't really interested in securing people's passwords anymore. I really wanted to do something better with my time. And so went to Stanford, really learned a lot with all the graduate machine learning courses there and learning under Andrew Ng and all that other type of stuff. And one day I came back home for winter break. Arya picked me up from the airport and he was like, let's go see Ron. So we drove for 4 hours and spun around the entire city. And I don't know, there was something about that moment where we just talked about some of the most existential questions in life, like is life deterministic or does everything happen for a reason and stuff like this. And it was such an enjoyable conversation with the best people that I knew. And I went back to school that next week and I was like, I'm gonna text both these guys. Like I would drop out to build a startup with them and build my vision. And the next week we got started. So yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's an amazing story. It's great to hear just that you guys live up to the hype, I guess, because those are not the conversations I have with my friends. And so maybe I needed better conversations. And Ron, what about you? What's sort of I see the connection to Arya, which is he duped Pranav in chess, and now Pranav is forever indebted to him. But what's sort of your story like? What does high school consist of for you and college and etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like to start my story a lot earlier than high school, and similar to Pranav, like for me, it was like for as long as I can remember, I just like hated people telling me what to do, and I think that's like really bad when you're in school and have to listen to teachers or have a structured environment. But it's really good if you're starting a startup, at least until you're then have to listen to investors to some extent. And it's not as like lacking of authority as I would have liked.
Or your customers.
Yeah, I mean, like there's guardrails in the real world, but when I was young, I really just like hated doing anything anybody told me. So this was like, in elementary school, I got like all of my classmates in third grade to make rainbow loom bracelets, like those rubber band bracelets. I don't know if you've heard of them, but, like you kind of put together. And I basically like started selling them and giving like the people who made them cuts of the profit. I made a few $100s off this. It was like the most money you could ever imagine as like an 8-year-old. And then the school found out and they made me donate every single dollar I had made, which at the time I was like deeply, deeply upset about. I get like it made the world a better place. So in hindsight, like not too bad. But that was like one of the first things I did in my founding journey, if you will. That led me to middle school. In middle school, I like saved up money and I bought a 3D printer and I started 3D printing fidget spinners for literally every single person in my class. Like I designed custom ones, like people's names on them. Like I literally put in an Amazon order for like 1,000 ball bearings one day, and my mom was just like, "What?" Like it was a box full of ball bearings that just came on the door. I was like, "Trust me, it's important." This time I made a few $1,000s off of it, which again, for an eighth grader was like literally the most money I could ever imagine. I got to keep it this time. So I literally bought a better 3D printer and like thought I was going to scale up the operation. And then I realized that 3D printed fidget spinners aren't venture scale, which was a sad realization at 14 years old.
But still, I mean, not to throw shade at some companies, but middle school Ron was doing more than some venture funded companies. That's awesome.
All you got to do is talk to your customers. And yeah, so and that was kind of like my thing was just always like kind of doing things for the sake of doing them. I could list like 100 other things. Like I randomly built like a Mars rover that I just like would drive around my house. Like I got like my third grade friends together to like design a rocket to go to an exoplanet that's 600 light years away. And we had like all these designs for it that have never panned out. This led me to high school where I kind of like took this and channeled it into more like real things per se. And I spent most of my time in high school working on two main projects. The first was actually after my grandfather passed away from Alzheimer's. I spent a few years building an accessible screening system for Alzheimer's disease where you could take a smartphone camera, take a video of a person writing with a regular pen and paper, and based on patterns in their movement, I like developed my own like, computer vision algorithms to actually determine, a pre-screening system for Alzheimer's disease. So you could, before you even had like clinical symptoms, the ability to actually have like a standard diagnostic test pick up on them, you could just take a 5-minute video and get these insights. And that was a super cool experience for me because it was the first time I worked on something that was like deeply personal. And, I got the chance then to speak at some of the world's largest Alzheimer's conference in person, won an early career research award and all these things. And I just found it so cool to be able to speak to people about such an important problem and like literally sink years of time into building this system. On the flip side, I also spent a lot of my time in high school doing something completely different, which was building a liquid fueled rocket on a goat farm. And this was like, I often say like, I joke, but this is true. I don't think I'll ever do anything quite as cool as this, which is like, I was 16 years old, like leading a team of 60 people where like every weekend we'd go to this goat farm and we would just like, I would like drive a tractor around carrying like massive tanks of like ethanol and nitrous oxide and nitrogen and like pouring concrete and like soldering like our own custom circuit boards. And it was truly one of the coolest experiences I think you can have because the joke is that like it was rocket science and I learned a lot about like the most random fluid dynamics equations and like, like pressure dynamics and like nozzle design, like method of characteristics. Like I'm saying a bunch of random words that were like cool things that I spent like hundreds of hours learning how to do. Like we started it literally by reading 3 rocketry textbooks for like cover to cover. And we're like, yeah, we could probably do this. And then over time, like it started out, in one of our basements, just kind of putting all these things together. One thing led to another, we started raising funding. We like raised tens of thousands of dollars to actually build this thing. We were on a goat farm actually putting it together. And then, we were just testing like liquid fueled rocket engines on this goat farm, like every single weekend. And it was really cool because I learned a lot about all the scientific concepts, but also just like how to lead a team. And like, when you have 60 people working on a project like this, right, they were split across 10 different teams. Like some people were working on the software, some people were working on the electronics, other people were like doing the plumbing, other people were like just raising money and making this possible. It really taught me a lot about what it takes to motivate people. And especially in this case, like we weren't paying people. Like these are a bunch of high school kids. Like the only way to get people into doing this was like to get them excited about being at work every day. And I think it's really similar to a startup, honestly, because people don't work at early stage startups because the salary's amazing or because anything. It's because they love what they're doing. And I think like as like we've been like working on expanding the team and bringing on really awesome people, that's like one of the experiences that I draw on that's so helpful because I had to literally figure out like how do you get a bunch of 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds to spend their entire Saturday and Sunday on this random goat farm an hour away from where they live. And so that was a really cool experience. Anyways, I rambled about that a little bit too much. That led me to college. In college, I definitely like felt, I always knew I wanted to start something kind of based on this background. I feel like it's pretty clear. But I think freshman year challenged my thoughts there a little bit where I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. You go to Harvard, everybody's either like pre-law or pre-consulting or some more traditional path. And it kind of made me question like, is startups the right thing to do? But I actually really appreciative for that because I think it made sure that I was certain on what I wanted to do. Instead of making it like super easy to kind of just like follow a predefined path, it really made me think deeply about like what I wanted to do with my life. And, it was a twist of fate that I ran into a couple of my really good friends towards the end of freshman year in college. And we're just like, look, what if we just like build something together? And so we literally lived together in New York in a 1-bedroom apartment for 3 months and just like built an app together. It like wasn't really like a startup. It was just such like a cool experience to like working on something with people and building it. And, it didn't end up working out in terms of like, there were so many things that we didn't know at the time about how to work closely with customers, all the lessons that we have now. But to me, it like left me with such a like a hunger of like I realized like for certain that I wanted to build something. And so then I spent a lot of my sophomore year, building a lot of community. Like I found the idea of being around smart people is the most important thing, right? Like working with these guys, it's like being around the smartest people I've ever met every single day. And I think I wanted to try and start creating that. So I started an AI reading group. I like helped lead like a startups group at Harvard, like all these different things that help me be around a lot of the great people that I thought would get me in this direction. And it was really funny because it ended up being that the people that I wanted to work with are right in front of me the whole time, but also like so many amazing people that I met through this that, I actually met like Ali Partovi from the Neo team through one of these things that I ran. It was like our first backer. And I met like so many other people who are going to put us on this journey. And so those last few months in college taught me just so much about the value of being around the right people. And then that led us to, once we started this, like, we basically stopped going to class like a few weeks into the semester. We literally were doing this cold email thing that I mentioned earlier. It's like cold emailing every single, CFO or analyst we could figure out to get in contact. And we were just on 50 or 60 calls every single week. And then, yeah, basically like as soon as we could like leave school and kind of get out of there, we all moved over to Palo Alto, started working in like a little shack there for a few months. And then, yeah, the rest is history. So
yeah, that's amazing. I mean, a couple things there. First of all, shout out Ali. He's actually I think he was the first supporter of our newsletter, Why You Should Join as well. So a first believer in many things. But I guess the second thing there is, you touched on it a little bit, but yeah, I'm curious about Pranav recounted it as well, which is there seemed like there was a night excursion that really sealed the deal for him. And, you guys started to work on a startup together. Why FP&A and CFO co-pilots? Like, where did that come from? Or did you start somewhere else? I'm curious about like where you guys started and how'd you end up where you are today?
Sure. I mean, I think we were always interested in how do we build some sort of knowledge worker and how can we put that to some sort of vertical. That was like the premise of how we all came together. Now, how we actually wanted to implement that was multiple pivots away, right? And so one of the first projects we actually ever embarked on was Arya's dad was a wealth manager, and he kind of proposed the question, what if a lot of the things that I'm doing in terms of creating models to actually analyze different stocks or analyze different equities or understand different portfolios could all be automated? But what if this actually applied for wealth managers, banks, and all these other types of financial institutions? And so we took our first stab at it, built out an MVP, and started approaching all these banks for our buy-side banks. And we were like, hey, look, we can do all this investment thesis for you. Like, we can create all these models for you on the fly. Like, it's super cool. And one of the things that we were immediately first met with was, sure, this is really cool. We're going to have to do this entire approval process, like a 2-year POC. You're going to have to sign a non-compete where you can't work with any of these other banks and all this other type of stuff. And the problem really got solidified for us, which was the fact that you could be doing an investment research analyst at some of these places, but you're going to be facing a lot of problems, right? Fundamentally, these big banks and these big financial institutions don't have a build versus buy decision, right? Like, they can fundamentally buy 50 of these AI products, POC all of them over a period of a year, and maybe churn out a couple of them and see which one's going to win out, and then eventually just buy them out, right? And so in reality, with that and the non-competes, it wasn't really that big of a market as we kind of hoped for. And so we were like, why don't we serve the 99% of companies that don't have this decision, right? And still apply the same concepts of finance, investment, right? Capital allocation, model creation, this idea of a finance knowledge worker for an industry that has been so antiquated, and in specific for a stack that no one has really ever thought about, right? Like, when you think about finance, everyone's first thought is, okay, let's talk about stocks. Let's talk about high frequency trading. No one ever thinks about the CFO stack. And so we were like, why don't we dig into this? And so we talked to 40 to 50 people every single week while we were still all in our college dorm room, while I was still sleeping in this one room double with probably 3 feet of separation between our 2 beds on calls every single day and missing all of our midterms and finals. And the one thing became so apparent, which was that these finance teams are inherently broken. And so Ron can get a little bit deeper into the story that we kind of experienced with some of these companies. But these strategic finance teams were 20 to 30 people having multi-million-dollar errors every single time they were doing analyses. No one caught them, and people were just okay with the fact that some of their products might not be doing the best. But then the CFO was always worried. He's like, I want to do better. I want to be able to invest better, but my analysts just don't know what's happening and they can't do their analysis on time. They're sending their analysis to India and they're getting back results, and we're like, we wish we could do this better, but we just don't know how. And so we tried to dig into what the key problem was, which was that pulling data from all these different sources took a ton of time. Doing modeling took a ton of time. And people were cutting corners at every single step to give subpar analysis that resulted in poor decisions for the company over and over again. And so we really exploited that problem. And we're like, right now the current toolings are, you have to do a 12-month migration. You have to do a BI tool, which is business intelligence, but most of them don't actually have intelligence, right? And so you have to do months of migration of moving unstructured data into structured outputs and then be able to use the tool. But they wanted something where they could log in, put their integrations in, upload their data, and in 2 or 3 minutes, they could start doing workflows immediately. Not get a dashboard out, but rather actual insights and work that can be done in just a couple minutes. That's much better than a normal analyst. And I think we were like, why don't we take that step with finance, something that's never been done before, and really apply to this industry? And so that's kind of how we got started.
I think, a couple things to add on there is just like, we were kind of faced with this. I mean, as we were talking to people across the finance world, we mentioned like we were just constantly on calls with people trying to, figure out the best angle of attack, because everybody's thought about building an autonomous financial analyst. It's like kind of like one of those things that everybody's like, why do people spend so much time in spreadsheets? Why do people do all this? But you have to tackle it in a unique way. And this is kind of like, we got pulled in this direction. And I think it became, all these mixture of like the buy versus build decision. Like who is the ideal customer? Even more than that, it was like, what's the most interesting thing to build here? Is it the AI that knows how to evaluate a company at a single point in time and help you make an investment decision? Or is it the AI that can understand the current status of a company, the operating decisions that it makes day to day, and help those be better? Like that second one sounds so much more interesting. That's so much more breadth of what you can use it for. And that's really what pushed us in that direction. But I would say the most important thing for us in going through this process was just like having an incredibly high velocity. And I think this is the key thing that every startup has to have early, is you have to have zero ego. Like nothing you're doing is right until a customer demonstrates that it's right. And even when one customer demonstrates that it's right, that customer could be a weird outlier. You have to have a lot of customers demonstrate that it's right. And so for us, it was about, getting on these calls, talking to people. We would test a hypothesis, and then pretty quickly we would like move to a new type. Like we would iterate through this space as quickly as possible, like from a cohort of 50 people to the next cohort of 50 to the next cohort of 50, all of which were kind of being tailored by what we'd learned from the previous calls. And only when we got to the point where I would be on calls with CFOs and I could like tap Pranav or Arya on the shoulder and be like, they're about to say this. And like word for word, like I would predict what they were going to say next. Like that's when we knew we had figured out that we were in a space that we understood really well and the problems were present. And then it got to the point where, at the time we were 3 19-year-olds on Zoom calls with CFOs of some of the world's biggest companies. And they literally just sent over all of their financial data. And like, this was weird. Like our mentor we were working with at the time, I remember telling him like, hey, like we want to try and get data from like one company by next week. And he's like, well, how are you going to know if you're getting closer? Like, what's the best metric? I'm like, honestly, I don't know. It's going to be really tough. And we get on the call with him a week later and we're like, we have data from 6 companies. And he was just like, what? And I was like, yeah, I don't really know. Like we sent them an NDA and they just gave us all of their information. And that was a hugely compelling reason to realize like, this is a big problem space and like, there's a lot to do here. And then over time, we've just built so much more conviction in it. Like, I think one of the coolest things is when we told our friends we were dropping out of school to build an AI FP&A analyst, first of all, like they were all just like, what's FP&A? And then second of all, they were like, that sounds like the most boring thing ever. But it's like today, like I'll talk to my friends from school about it, or like prospective hires, like, look, we're building the AI that can understand these company financials inside and out. We're building this embedding model that can take all this high dimensional data and make a low dimensional representation of it. For lack of making too many analogies, it's like, what's the next token prediction for a company? Like what's going to happen next in a company given its current state? And people get so excited about this. They're like, wow, this is like one of the most interesting problem spaces. But it's purely about us learning more about it and understanding more. So that's some of my thoughts there. I think Arya can also talk a little bit about some of the crazy stories that we had early on with customers. And also his background is much more interesting than both of ours. So he should definitely jump in and add that as well.
Absolutely. And Arya, I was going to say, it sounds like you guys owe your dad a lot of this company. I But yes, Arya, please.
No, I literally would watch. So he's an investment advisor, and so he has his own practice, and he'd like work from home mostly, and so he would put CNBC on every day. It's from like as early as I can remember. I would watch like Squawk Box, Andrew Ross Sorkin, Becky Quick, Joe Kernan. Like I'd watch them every day, and like for an hour at least right before school, and I would always see that, and I would then like see what he's doing on his like the screen and everything, all the work he's doing, and he's like why isn't this automated, like why is this like this, and I would help him like with his portfolio optimization algorithms, and I like would do that for him, and I'm like, why are you spending this much time every day like doing such menial tasks?
And to be clear, you were helping him with this portfolio optimization when you were in high school, college?
Middle school.
Wow. Okay. So you're just as much of a loser as these guys.
All right, yeah.
That's amazing. Okay, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, he would be showing me that, and I'm like, this is very arbitrary. You're kind of just like you have so much data you have access to, but you're not actually like doing anything with it. You're kind of just making approximations and making assumptions and just running with it. And I'm like, there's so much can be done here. And to take a step back, actually, I will say like most of my childhood was actually spent playing golf. So I wasn't doing this. I was trying to be a competitive golfer. I was top 100 in the world from ages 11 to 13.
Oh, wow. Top 100 in the world. Okay.
I was planning on going pro. My friends out here, they're playing at these D1 schools. They're doing amazing. I was with them every summer. That was what I spend most of my time on, is just playing golf. And at some point, I realized, I didn't want to get homeschooled or move to Florida like they did. And a lot of respect to them. I know they're killing it. I keep in touch with them. My goal is to sponsor them soon on the PGA Tour. I know some of them are going to make it, but yeah, I kind of realized I don't really want to get homeschooled and move to Florida. And so around that time, also just, was helping my dad with a bunch of stuff. Also got into just found out about ML, found out about intelligence. I was doing like competitive math, competitive programming, and realized I really like solving hard problems. And the idea of intelligence and creating that was just really inspiring. And so when I went into high school, with these two guys freshman year, some of my closest friends right from the get go. By sophomore year, these guys are like my brothers, and so I would work with Pranav and Ron all the time, and we I think learned so much about the space together. And by the time I went to college, I was studying CS and math. Freshman year, this PhD student, I was like, I really want to do ML research. That's kind of what I was like really interested in. I just ran into him like November of my freshman year, so right really early on, and kind of just took me under his wing. I started with like world modeling, and had a paper go out to iClear and I guess NeurIPS as well for it, and was helping him with that. And then the professor, who both him and the PhD student at this point have just been teaching me a bunch, they were like, screw it, like I'll give you funding, like work on whatever you want. And so from there I kind of got really into library learning, as I was kind of talking about, in program synthesis, and was working towards my PhD actually with them. I did all the courses for it, and I got my own first author publication out at NeurIPS, and it's coming out in a month. So I'm going to be visiting there, repping Sapien. So it's more of a recruiting trip than talking about my research that I worked on for a year and a half. But like,
Recruiting trip.
I'll take it. Yeah,
Whatever it takes to justify on the balance sheet, huh?
yeah. But I really enjoyed doing research. Like, I really enjoyed finding these hard problems, solving them, proving your hypotheses are valid. I will say, like, I didn't really like the whole paper writing aspect, curating towards these publications. And kind of around that time was when we had this little trip where picked Pranav from the airport. We got Ron in the car as well, and we were driving around. And I'm like, I realized from all these years building with them in high school that this is the type. It's not only that I enjoyed working on those type of problems, I enjoyed specifically building with these guys too. And so we kind of took it from there, where they pulled me out of the whole like PhD route, dark side, and we started just working on Sapien. And it started out as in like, was thinking, what was I doing for my dad, and what were the type of problems he was running into? And so it was an auto DCF model, and started into like, making these investment decisions for buy side hedge funds. And from there, as these guys were talking about, we realized, FP&A is where it's at, and how can AI run a company, which, yeah, it's just really, really enjoyed building with these two guys. Wouldn't do it with anybody else, but they've been my best friends for a while, and love every day work with them.
Wow, that's awesome. And I know you guys are busy people, so I promise these are the last few questions I have, and then I'll let you guys cut loose. But Ron brought this up, and I guess we've hinted at this a couple, which is the whole point of velocity and building fast and moving fast. It'd be good if you guys can maybe put a timeline on all of this, because I know the timeline, but I think it's really impressive to the audience to hear about it too, which is, when did you decide to start working on a startup? If I'm not mistaken, you guys were accepted to Neo NYC, and then picked one and then iterated and now are here? Like, what is the time span on this? Maybe put it on the calendar for us.
Yeah, I mean, so we had that conversation after winter break, and it was like January, February. We're experimenting with a ton of ideas. We basically were doing anything that could maybe get a little bit of Twitter hype and doing some of those like cool projects, and eventually kind of got into the stuff that Arya's dad was kind of telling us about
January and February of this year.
of this year. Yeah. And so around March, we basically rushed in about a week to build an MVP for the idea that we had, which was doing this automatic model creation for buy side hedge funds. Got accepted into YC and ended up doing our YC and new interviews all over spring break. Ron was in Cancun, Arya was on vacation in Aspen. My spring break was a little bit later, so I was still in my stuffy one room double in Stanford. Everything was kind of happening at the same time, and we never really processed any of it. And then kind of got accepted into these programs, ended up doing the Neo Accelerator and got accepted into that. And we had a couple of really good conversations within the investment team and really analyzed what we were doing at that point in time and understood that this was around like April-ish, that like, maybe this isn't the path that we want to go down for, and ended up actually pivoting a couple times from like April into May. And they did a lot of customer discovery, really understood a lot about the space. The worst thing we could ever do was create a product that no one ever wanted. And so basically just talked to a ton of people. May, Ron and Arya moved over into our little humble shack in Palo Alto. And then at that point, I was still in school. And so I was kind of like balancing finals and doing all of this. Haven't ever checked my grades actually as to what I thought.
Probably don't want to check those either. They won't be good.
Yeah, I'm just never going to check it ever again. And so ended up moving to the house after visiting them every single day after like 2 or 3 weeks. And by the end of June, we had like a V0, and then ended up going to Copper Mountain for the Neo Accelerator, started pitching a lot of customers. And we actually ended up getting our first really big 6-figure contract literally off of understanding that they had a $10 million mistake. And so the story goes like this, is that we found one of the biggest manufacturers for a specific type of car product in the United States. And we were looking at their finances, and they make $700-800 million of revenue. And we were like, there's no way they have anything wrong with their finances. But they were so eager to give their finances to us, and we were a little bit confused. And so they were like, hey, why don't you guys do our July board deck for us, and we'll compare your models with ours. And so the night before they were going to present to their board, we basically compare our models to theirs. And we realized for attribution analysis for a certain type of product, it's $10 million off in the wrong direction, actually. And so we went one step deeper, and Arya was like, there's no way. I refuse to believe that our systems are bad. We know so much about how financials work. It has to be them. And so Arya spent the next, I think, 12, 13 hours digging through millions of rows of Excel spreadsheets, ERP data, literally doing the work that normal finance analysts would be doing at this company. They completely messed up. They basically flipped May and June at a couple points in their model. They basically used a certain type of Excel formula that basically only got the first vendor name for a transaction. It was a unit instead of a sum if. And so all of this added to saying that they were making $10 million for this one product. But in fact, for the previous month, for the last 4 years, every time they ran this analysis, they were losing $2 million. That every month. And they never noticed. And so we sent them this entire long thread, and we're like, look, you guys present this to your board deck, but you guys are going to be completely wrong when you present this to your private equity firm, just letting you know. And they were like, there's no way. Let's meet next week to talk about this. And they were so adamant with the fact that they thought they were right. And then Arya spent 4 hours with them on call and dug through their models, and we're asking them why they did every single thing that the way that they did. And they were like, oh, damn, you're right. Let's pay you 6 figures to go do this for us. And so that was such a high moment of conviction for us, where we were just like, this happens all the time. And we managed to help catch a $10 million error. And I think that would have been super costly for them. They're a low margin business. And, I think that's a really cool beauty about this, is that you can help these businesses out that are family owned, like that have the most interesting backstories. You can learn so much about different perspectives across the US for all these different types of companies. And you're really helping companies that have never been integrated to technology really be at the focal point of getting AI when they never have been before.
Yeah. Wow. So you guys are 19, 20-year-olds. You sprint out an MVP in a week and find a $10 million error for some enterprise team.
It was over a month when we built the second version of it, when we eventually caught this. But then, ended Copper Mountain, did a couple more iterations with the product, got a couple more customers, and then hit September, and we really found our product to be super sticky. And the one thing every single person said was like, if I was to lose this product, it would be like the worst thing in the world for me never to use this product again. And so we had people being like, this is going to change the way the company works, because basically we were redefining how finance was working at some of these enterprises, right? The private equity company that was owning this portfolio company could literally just tap into the company's finances without ever bugging the CFO or the CEO. The CEO could ask a question for ad hoc analysis without ever bugging the CFO or the finance team. And then salespeople and then even marketing people could run their own types of analysis to see how it impacted the company everywhere without ever having to bug the centralized server of a CFO. And when we think about how we were building this product in in August and September, and when we were pitching this, it was more of the fact that, look, this is how finance was done before. It was a very centralized server, one single node, and every single person was asking for this one piece of information. But what if we decentralize finance at companies? And that's our grandiose vision and how we want to change how companies run fundamentally.
And yeah, I guess my final question to just wrap out the entire podcast, which has been a pleasure so far, is, I mean, I'd be remiss not to ask, but how do you guys sort of think about the competitive landscape here? I know you guys brought it up yourself, which is Microsoft Copilot. As a layman in this space, right, my mind immediately jumps there. I don't actually know where they're at, but I'm sure they're doing something with Excel. And I definitely have at least heard conversation of other startups wanting to be in the space. Finance seems like a no-brainer. All the money's there too, right? How are you guys kind of viewing yourself in this competitive landscape?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few key ideas to think about here. The first thing I'll start off with is our vision, because I think it's really important to articulate where we're going to be in 5 years, so then think about how that shapes our competitive landscape. Our goal is, look, today we save companies thousands of hours. We catch these mistakes. We're making analysts and finance teams 10 times better at what they do. That's great. That's like awesome. But the vision we really want to build is, can you build this shadow CFO, this proactive system that is analyzing every piece of data in a company consistently? And instead of people having to ask it questions, it's surfacing insights. It's, your CFO is waking up in the morning and it's like, look, your competitor had an earnings call and here's what's happened. So it's looking at external data. Your CRM has new information about some deals that happened and your sales team is missing the mark by 3% this quarter. And it goes even further than to actually, let's say, go to your ERP and pull data from like 3 new departments that upload new data, and takes all of these, and your CFO wakes up in the morning and it's like, look, here's the decisions you should make as a result, right? Invest $10 million in this area, cut back spending in this area. It's being proactive, and it's basically like understanding the company and identifying these opportunities for what they should be doing. And that's a totally different paradigm than the current form of this technology. So then you think about that future, there's a few different types of competitors that we think about today. The first is the current generation of, FP&A tools that finance teams are using. You look at, Cube or Anaplan or Adaptive or Data Rails. These are all just a bunch of different tools that they're using today. And most of them kind of fall into that area that Pranav was speaking about earlier, where they're like dashboards, or they're like, I like to call it like BI without the I, like business intelligence that doesn't really understand your company. And those are like somewhat competitive in the sense that they pull from the same pocketbook, but they're also just such different products, because the coolest thing about our product, like with Sapien, is like I can type in what kind of company is this, and just based on the Excels and like the ERP data, like it knows what company it's working with. It can tell like, oh, this is like a subscription SaaS. This is like a services business. It actually understands what's going on. When you create a graph, you can follow up and ask deeper questions. And this is all to say, like, before we even had a product, one of the customers we spoke to, or potential customers, was like a big glass manufacturer. And he was like, look, like I just had a call with like one of your competitors in the space this morning, and I was going to go with them. But what you guys are talking about here is like a generation ahead of what they're offering. I'm going to wait to sign until I get to see what you guys are really building. And, sure enough, we came back, we showed him the product a few months later, and he was like super excited about it. He's now like in our pilot program. And I think like that's a really cool example of just people realizing there's another generation here. There's another type of competitor, which is the really big players, right? You look at Microsoft, Oracle, Salesforce, these are all big companies that want to own the mapping from data to decision making at big companies, which is ultimately what we're going after. And the key difference between us and them is, first of all, you have to build these systems from the ground up. Like we've seen firsthand, you have to build your own representation of Excel. You have to build all these systems to be really nimble and really able to solve these needs. But even bigger than that is they actually, like, you think they have a data moat, right? They own all the numbers, they have all the information there. The truth is they don't own the processes. And this is where you want to build a startup that's going to tackle these big incumbents. It's they don't know what people actually do with this data because they all export it and they all do it in other places, and it's not like something that they're harnessing. The cool thing about what we're doing is we kind of see it similar to like the Cursor IDE approach or like the Tesla autopilot, where we can collect really rich data on how people do these processes, right? Where they're challenging, where they're following up, where they're asking questions. Whenever we ask a question, it's like, oh, there's data in your ERP and in your Excel that are both possible data sources. Which one do you want to look at? We're building this understanding of how humans do this work that is going to set us apart from these big players because we're capturing this unique layer that they don't have today. So you look at the existing tools that are just kind of a step behind, and sure, they can throw on a chatbot, but you need to build this AI from the ground up. And you look at the big players, but they're fundamentally not able to move fast enough into this space. And they also just don't have as much of a moat as you would think. And we thread the needle perfectly between those two in the sense of like, look, we're coming with a really technically oriented approach. We have really first principles angle on how to solve these problems. And we also have the ability to build a data flywheel long term where we call the term intelligence lock-in, where it's like companies use the product and it's just going to get better and better for them every time. And the whole system overall is going to get better because Sapien will learn better and better how humans do these processes. And so when we think about the long-term vision of can you build the shadow CFO, can you build the AI that runs a company, all these pieces really come into play where there's a lot of people loosely in this space, but we don't really see anybody as competitive because it's really like we have such a different angle on how to solve this problem.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Well, guys, thank you so much. For those listening who are interested, and I'm sure many are you guys hiring right now? Who should reach out to you? What's the website? Plug all the details.
Yeah. I mean, we're hiring right now. I mean, one of the biggest things we touched on it a bunch during this podcast, but we basically see ourselves as building 10 startups in one and working on the hardest, most technical problems with really high impact. And so we're looking for people who have deep technical knowledge, right? You know, you actually know what an RNN is and don't just know what an LLM is. Like you actually understand at least like the ins and outs of the cool tech that we're like working on here, but also have an appreciation for kind of the end-to-end vision of what we're building here. We kind of see all the people we're bringing on early as, you know, they're almost going to be founders of their own startup within a startup. And so they have to be able to get in the weeds, get nitty gritty with building new architectures, building our own in-house systems. We build pretty much everything in-house, but also being able to think about the customers and how this impacts product and all these other things. So I'd say that, you know, the role we like to think of it as is, you know, these founding engineers that are really on the technical side, but can kind of cover all the bases. And really just like, we want to build a team that's less about, we see it less as hiring and more about as who do we want to just really be great friends with for the next, you know, 5, 10, 15 years, right? We see this as like true partners with us along in this journey and building say, they can run a company. So if you're somebody who loves working on hard problems, if you love, you know, iterating closely with customers and having a lot of impact, and if you're just, you know, excited about being in a room of, you know, people who constantly challenge yourself. I mean, I love being in a room with these guys and the people that we're bringing on because it's such a pleasure to constantly be challenged in your thinking and have to learn and have to push those boundaries. And we're a place where, you know, people are opinionated, people push really hard in different angles, but we are constantly learning and pushing forward. So if that's the culture that sounds right for you, if you like research and product and all those things mixed together, Sapien's probably the right place for you and would love to talk. Our website is getsapien.com or all our first names at sapien.team for an email is also great.
Yeah. And you guys are based in San Francisco, correct?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, for those in the audience interested, please do reach out. I can personally say a superstar team that we're dealing with here. And guys, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.